My name is Emma, and I'm 17 years old. But sometimes I feel like I've lived 1,000 lifetimes in this house that never felt like home. I suppose the first thing you should know about me is that I was never supposed to exist. Not in the way my parents planned their perfect little family, anyway. I was the accident that derailed their dreams, the unwanted surprise that turned their carefully orchestrated life into chaos. They never learned to manage the morning everything. Change started like any other Tuesday in October. The leaves outside my bedroom window had turned that brilliant shade of amber that makes you believe in magic for just a moment before reality crushes that hope. I remember staring at those leaves while the shouting downstairs grew louder, wondering if trees ever wished they could pack their roots and move to a different forest. That's when I heard my father's voice rise above my mother's, sharp and cutting like broken glass. She's the reason we can't have anything nice in this house. I pressed my ear against the cold wooden floor, straining to hear what fresh hell my existence had apparently caused this time. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I held my breath, terrified that even the sound of my breathing might remind them I was there, taking up space in their world. "Look at these bills, Margaret," my father continued, his voice dripping, with the kind of resentment that had become as familiar as the wallpaper in our cramped hallway. The school wants money for her field trip. There's another doctor's appointment for her asthma medication, and don't even get me started on how much food she eats. It's like throwing money into a bottomless pit. My stomach clenched, not from hunger, though. I was always hungry in that house, but from the familiar ache of knowing I was being discussed like a burden, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. I had learned early that love in our house was conditional, rationed like wartime supplies, and somehow I had never qualified for even the smallest portion. My mother's voice was quieter, but no less devastating. Sometimes I wonder what our lives would have been like if she never finished that sentence, but she didn't need to. The silence that followed said everything. Sometimes I wonder what our lives would have been like if you had never been born, Emma, if you had never existed. To complicate everything we worked for, I pulled my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible on the cold floor of my bedroom. This room that wasn't really mine, with its peeling paint and the window that wouldn't close properly, letting in the bitter October wind that seemed to seep into my bones. Everything in this house belonged to them, was chosen by them, controlled by them. I was just an unwelcome guest who had overstayed her welcome by 17 years. The conversation downstairs shifted, and I caught fragments that made my blood run cold. They were planning something. There were words like boarding school and military academy and tough love floating up through the thin floors. My father's voice had taken on that decisive tone he used when he'd made up his mind about something, and my mother's responses had become shorter, more agreeable. Whatever they were plotting, she was going along with it. I crawled back to my bed, pulling the threadbare blanket over my head, trying to create a cocoon where their words couldn't reach me. But there was no hiding from the truth that had been building for years like storm clouds on the horizon. They didn't want me here. They had never wanted me here. And now they were finally ready to do something about it. The house fell silent eventually, but I lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind rattle my broken window and wondering how a person learns to disappear when disappearing isn't really an option. I thought about those amber leaves outside, how they would eventually fall and be swept away, making room for new growth. Maybe that's what my parents were hoping for, that if they could just sweep me away, their real life could finally begin. But I wasn't ready to fall. Not yet. Even if staying meant enduring another day of being punished for the simple act of existing in their world. Asterisk the next morning arrived with the kind of heavy silence that settles over a house after a storm. I could hear my parents moving around downstairs, their footsteps careful and deliberate, as if they were walking through a minefield of their own making. I dressed quickly in the same jeans I'd worn for 3 days running, not because I wanted to, but because the washing machine had been broken for months, and my father insisted it wasn't worth fixing when we were throwing money away on more important things. When I finally worked up the courage to go downstairs for breakfast, I found them sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread between them like battle plans. My mother looked up when I entered, and there was something different in her eyes. Not quite guilt, but maybe the distant cousin of regret that appears when someone realizes they're about to cross a line they can never uncross. "Sit down, Emma," my father said without looking up from whatever document he was studying. His voice was calm, which somehow made it more terrifying than his usual anger. Calm meant he had made a decision. Calm meant there would be no negotiating. No appeals for mercy, no last-minute reprieve from whatever judgment they had decided to pass down. I took my usual seat at the scarred wooden table, my hands folded in my lap like a defendant awaiting sentencing. The kitchen smelled like coffee and toast, but there was no plate set for me, no indication that my breakfast had been considered in their morning routine. This wasn't unusual. I had learned years ago to fend for myself when it came to meals, but today it felt especially pointed, like they were already practicing for my absence. "We've been doing a lot of thinking lately," my mother began, her voice steady but not quite meeting my eyes. "About what's best for this family, what's best for everyone involved." She paused, reaching for her coffee mug with hands that trembled slightly. "Your father and I have decided that some changes need to be made." The word changes hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. I wanted to ask what kind of changes. Wanted to defend myself against accusations I hadn't heard yet, but my voice seemed to have abandoned me entirely. I sat there, mute and helpless. Waiting for the axe to fall dot, my father finally looked up from his papers, and I could see the calculations behind his eyes, the cold arithmetic of a man who had weighed my worth and found it lacking. "You're going to be staying with your Aunt Ruth for a while," he announced, as casually as if he were telling me about a change in the weather. "She has that big house up in Montana, plenty of space, and she's agreed to take you in." Aunt Ruth. I had met her exactly twice in my life, both times at family gatherings where she sat in the corner nursing a glass of wine and making cutting remarks about everyone else's life choices. She was my mother's sister, 10 years older, and twice as bitter, with the kind of sharp edges that suggested she had given up on softness a long time ago. For how long? I managed to whisper, though part of me already knew the answer. My parents exchanged a look. One of those wordless conversations that married couples perfect over years of shared disappointment. "We're not sure yet," my mother said carefully. "It depends on a lot of factors. How well you adjust, how things go here, whether—" She trailed off, leaving the sentence dangling like a noose. "Whether they decided they wanted me back. Whether the first proved myself worthy of their tolerance. Whether they missed me enough to overlook the inconvenience of my existence." But we all knew the truth, even if none of us were brave enough to speak it aloud. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. This was exile, dressed up in the language of family concern and fresh starts. "When?" I asked, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "This weekend," my father replied, already turning back to his papers. "Ruth is expecting you Saturday morning." "We've already spoken to the school about transferring your records." Saturday morning, 3 days. 72 hours to pack up 17. Years of life and disappear from the only home I had ever known, even if it had never felt like home at all. I wondered if they had already called the school, if my teachers would spend Monday morning wondering why Emma's desk was empty, or if they would simply fold over my absence like water closing over a stone. I stood up from the table, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked toward the stairs without another word. Behind me, I could hear my parents resume their quiet conversation, the sound of papers rustling, the clink of coffee cups against saucers. Mundane sounds of people moving on with their lives, already forgetting the girl they had just erased. From their future dot in my room, I sat on the edge of my narrow bed and looked around at the space that would soon be empty. There wasn't much to pack. My life had never been cluttered with possessions or mementos. A few books from the library, some clothes that had seen better days, a shoebox full of letters from a pen pal I'd had in middle school. They accumulated. Evidence of a life lived small, held close, never quite taking up the space it deserved. 3 days to say goodbye to everything I had ever known. 3 days to prepare for exile. 3 days to figure out how to survive in a world where even my own family had decided I was too much trouble to keep around. The 3 days passed in a blur of mechanical preparation and emotional numbness. I moved through the house like a ghost, packing my meager belongings while my parents continued their lives around me with careful indifference. They had perfected the art of looking through me rather than at me, as if acknowledging my presence might somehow weaken their resolve. On Thursday evening, I found myself standing in the doorway of what had once been my older brother Michael's room. He had left for college 2 years ago and never looked back, not even for holidays. His room remained exactly as he had left it, a shrine to the son who had gotten out, who had made something of himself, who had justified every sacrifice my parents had made for his success. His soccer trophies still lined the shelves. His academic awards still hung on the walls. His bed still made with the expensive sheets my mother had bought for his high school graduation. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Michael's room was preserved, like a museum, while mine would probably be converted into a storage closet before I even reached the Montana state line. He had earned the right to be remembered, to have his space held sacred in their hearts. I had only earned the right to disappear. I thought about calling him, telling him what was happening, but what would be the point? Michael had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and I had always been the mistake that followed. When we were younger, he used to protect me from our parents' worst moments, creating distractions when their anger threatened to boil over. But college had changed him, or maybe it had just revealed who he really was beneath the brotherly obligation. His calls home grew less frequent, his visits shorter, and when he did come around, he looked at me with the same vague disappointment I saw in our parents' eyes. Friday night, my last night in the house where I was born, I barely slept. I lay in my narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds that had formed the soundtrack of my childhood. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of settling wood, the distant sound of trains passing through town at midnight. These sounds that had once made me feel trapped now felt precious. Irreplaceable pieces of a life I was about to lose forever. Around 2 a.m, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They paused outside my door, and for a moment I thought my mother might knock, might come in to offer some last-minute comfort or explanation. But the footsteps moved on, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the bitter understanding that even now, even on my last night, I wasn't worth the effort of a proper goodbye. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that seems designed to match the mood of difficult departures. I carried my single suitcase downstairs to find my father loading a thermos of coffee into the car. He had volunteered to drive me to Montana, though I suspected it was less about paternal duty and more about making sure I actually left Dot. My mother stood by the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug as if it were an anchor keeping her steady. When she saw me, she offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The kind of expression people wear when they're trying to convince themselves that unnecessary cruelty is actually an act of kindness. "Did you remember to pack your asthma inhaler?" she asked, and for a moment she almost sounded like a real mother, concerned about her child's well-being. "Yes," I replied, patting the side pocket of my jacket where the familiar shape pressed against my ribs. "Good. Ruth knows about your condition, that you'll need to find a doctor out there to refill your prescription when it runs out." She paused, seeming to realize that she was talking about my future as if it were a separate country she would never visit. "I put some money in an envelope in your suitcase for emergencies. $50 I would discover later. $50 to start a new life in a place where I knew nobody, where I had no friends, no connections, no safety net beyond the grudging charity of an aunt who had agreed to take me in as a favor to her sister." The drive to Montana stretched. Ahead of us, like a prison sentence, 18 hours of forced intimacy with a man who had spent 17 years, making it clear that my existence was an inconvenience he could barely tolerate. We drove in silence for the first hour, the radio providing a buffer against the weight of everything we weren't saying to each other, somewhere outside the city limits. As the familiar landmarks of my childhood disappeared in the rearview mirror, my father finally spoke. "You know this is for the best, don't you?" he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Sometimes families need space to figure things out. Sometimes people need a fresh start." I wanted to ask him whose fresh start this was really about, but I bit my tongue and nodded instead. It was easier to agree, to play along with the fiction that this was somehow about my benefit rather than their relief. "Ruth will be good for you," he continued, warming to his theme. "She's tough, but fair. She'd teach you things your mother and I couldn't. How to be independent, how to stand on your own 2 feet. You'll thank us someday." The certainty in his voice was breathtaking. He had convinced himself so thoroughly that exile was education, that abandonment was opportunity, that I almost admired his commitment to the delusion. It would have been easier, in some ways, if he had simply admitted the truth, that they didn't want me, that they had never wanted me, and that they had finally found a socially acceptable way to get rid of me. Miles passed beneath our wheels, taking me further from everything I had ever known and closer to an uncertain future with a woman who had never shown the slightest interest in my existence. I pressed my face to the window and watched the landscape change from familiar to foreign, wondering if this was what it felt like to die, this gradual separation from everything that had once defined your world. Aunt Ruth lived in a sprawling Victorian house on the outskirts of a town called Cedar Falls. Population 2,847, according to the weathered sign we passed on our way through Main Street. The house sat on several acres of overgrown land, painted a faded yellow that had probably been cheerful once, but now looked jaundiced against the gray October sky. A wraparound porch sagged under the weight of neglect, and paint peeled from the window frames like old skin when my father pulled into the gravel driveway. The sound of our tires seemed unnaturally loud in the rural quiet. I could hear birds. In the distance, the rustle of wind through bare trees and nothing else. No traffic, no neighbors mowing lawns, no children playing in nearby yards. Just silence, stretching out in all directions like an ocean of emptiness. Ruth emerged from the front door before we had even turned off the engine. She was taller than I remembered, with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue. Eyes that seemed to catalog every flaw and weakness in a single glance. She wore practical clothes, dark jeans, work boots, a flannel shirt that had seen better days, and moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned to depend only on herself. "So," she said as we got out of the car, her voice carrying the flat vowels of someone who had spent her life in rural places, "this is the girl who's been causing all the trouble." My father laughed uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether she was joking or simply stating what she believed to be fact. Emma's a good kid, Ruth. She just needs some guidance, some structure. A different environment. Ruth's eyes fixed on me with the intensity of a hawk studying a mouse. Is that what you need, Emma? Guidance and structure? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. What was I supposed to say? That I needed parents who didn't see me as a burden? That I needed to belong somewhere, to matter to someone? That I needed to understand why my very existence seemed to be such a source of pain for the people who were supposed to love me. Instead, I just nodded, playing my part in this performance of family concern and fresh opportunities. Well, Ruth said, hefting my suitcase out of the trunk with surprising ease, I suppose we'll find out soon enough what you really need. Come on inside. Let's get you settled before your father has to start the drive back. The interior of the house was dark and cluttered, filled with the accumulated possessions of someone who had lived alone for many years. Books lined every wall, stacked on tables and floors when the shelves overflowed. The furniture was old but solid, chosen for comfort rather than style. It smelled like coffee and old paper and something else I couldn't identify. Something that might have been loneliness given physical form. Ruth led me up a narrow staircase to a small room at the front of the house. It was simply furnished with a single bed, a wooden dresser, and a desk positioned under the window. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of mountains that looked like it had been cut from a magazine years ago. "This is yours," she sighed, setting my suitcase on the bed. "Bathroom's down the hall, second door on your right. I expect you to keep it clean. I also expect you to earn your keep around here. This isn't a hotel, and I'm not running a charity. You understand?" I nodded again, still struggling to find my voice in this strange new reality. My father appeared in the doorway, clearly eager to complete his mission and begin the long drive home. "Well," he said, checking his watch, "I should probably get going. Traffic will be bad if I wait much longer." He kissed my forehead, a brief, perfunctory gesture that felt more like a period at the end of a sentence than any kind of genuine affection. "Be good for Ruth," he said. "Work hard, stay out of trouble, and maybe we can talk about you coming home for a visit at Christmas." Maybe. That single word contained all the conditional love I had ever known from him, all the ways my worth was tied to my behavior, my usefulness, my ability to be less than I was. Ruth walked him to his car while I stood at my new bedroom window, watching my father drive away without looking back. His taillights disappeared around a bend in the road, taking with them the last physical connection to the life I had known. I was truly alone now, 1,800 miles from home, living with a woman who was essentially a stranger, in a town where nobody knew my name or cared whether I existed. That first night, after Ruth had shown me where she kept the extra blankets and explained her rules about mealtimes and chores, I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of a house I didn't understand. Every creak and settle seemed amplified in the darkness, foreign and somehow threatening. I had thought I understood loneliness living with parents who barely tolerated my presence, but this was different. This was complete isolation, a kind of exile so thorough that I began to question whether I had ever really existed at all. Ruth's house sat at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, their lights barely visible through the trees. I had never experienced such profound quiet, such absolute separation from the rhythms of human community. It was like being on another planet, one where the only other inhabitant was a stern woman who had agreed to house me out of family obligation. Rather than any genuine desire for my company. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I wondered if this was what my parents had imagined when they planned my exile. If they had pictured me alone in this vast emptiness, finally understanding the true cost of existing without permission in their carefully ordered world. My first week at Ruth's house passed in a haze of adjustment and bewilderment. She woke me each morning at 5:30 sharp, not with gentle encouragement, but with the sound of her boots on the stairs and a terse announcement that breakfast would be ready in 15 minutes. There were no second chances, no accommodations for teenage sleep patterns or the disorientation of finding myself in a completely foreign environment. Ruth had been clear about expectations from the beginning. I was to help with household chores, tend to her small vegetable garden, assist with basic maintenance around the property, and somehow manage to keep up with my schoolwork at Cedar Falls High School, where I had been enrolled as a senior despite having missed the first month of the academic year. It was a schedule designed to leave little time for self-pity or homesickness, though whether this was intentional or simply Ruth's natural way of living, I couldn't tell. The high school was a single-story brick building that looked like it had been constructed in the 1950s and hadn't been updated since. My homeroom teacher, Mrs. Henderson, introduced me to the class with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for announcing pop quizzes or detention. 23 pairs of eyes studied me with the polite but distant interest rural teenagers. Show toward outsiders, making quick assessments about whether I might be worth their attention. I could tell immediately that I would remain invisible here, just as I had been at home. These students had grown up together, had established their social hierarchies and friendship groups years ago, and there was no obvious place for a displaced girl from 18, 100 miles away who carried herself like someone expecting rejection. During lunch, I sat alone at a corner table, picking at a sandwich Ruth had packed and trying to pretend. I didn't notice the way conversations quieted slightly when I passed. The academic work was manageable, thankfully. I had always been a decent student, not brilliant like my brother Michael, but competent enough to avoid the kind of failure that would have given my parents another reason to view me as a disappointment. Here, catching up on missed assignments and adjusting to new teachers, I threw myself into schoolwork with desperate intensity. If I couldn't find belonging in social connections, perhaps I could at least prove my worth through academic achievement, but it was the evenings at Ruth's house that began to reveal the complexity of my exile. After dinner, which we ate in relative silence, Ruth would retreat to her study with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers. She worked as a freelance editor, I discovered, helping local businesses with their marketing materials and assisting graduate students with their dissertations. Her desk was a careful chaos of manuscripts, reference books, and red pens, organized according to some system that made sense only to her. One evening, about 2 weeks after my arrival, I knocked on her study door to ask about borrowing a book from her extensive library. She looked up from a manuscript she was marking, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and studied me with the same analytical gaze she probably applied to poorly structured paragraphs. "What kind of book?" she asked. "Fiction, maybe. Something to read before bed." I hesitated, then added, "You have so many books. I've never seen a private library like this." Something in her expression shifted slightly, though she tried to hide it. "Your mother never mentioned that you were a reader." The casual way she said it stung, the implication that my mother and she had discussed me, cataloged my qualities and defects like livestock being evaluated for purchase. "She probably didn't think it was important," I replied, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Ruth set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. What else didn't she think was important? The question caught me off guard. I had expected Ruth to be as disinterested in my inner life as my parents had always been, to treat me as a temporary inconvenience to be managed, rather than a person worth knowing. But there was genuine curiosity in her voice, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't fully understood. "I write," I admitted, the words coming out before I could stop them. Stories, mostly, sometimes poetry. My parents thought it was a waste of time. Do you have any of your writing with you? I shook my head. I left everything behind. They didn't seem interested in packing anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the desk. There's a notebook in the top drawer of your dresser, she said finally, and plenty of pens if you need them. Writing isn't a waste of time, Emma. It's one of the few things that makes the rest of life bearable. That night, I found the notebook she had mentioned, a simple composition book with black and white speckled covers. I held it for a long time before opening it, struck by the weight of blank pages and unlimited possibility. When had someone last given me permission to take up space, to fill emptiness with my own thoughts and dreams? I began writing about the journey to Montana, about the feeling of watching familiar landscapes disappear in the rearview mirror, about the peculiar grief of losing a home that had never felt like home. The words came slowly at first, rusty from disuse, but gradually gained momentum as I remembered what it felt like to have thoughts that belonged entirely to me. Writing in that notebook became my evening ritual, the one part of each day that felt entirely mine. I wrote about Ruth's house and the way silence could be both peaceful and suffocating. I wrote about my parents and the complicated ache of missing people who had never really wanted you around. I wrote about Cedar Falls High School in particular, loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw through you as if you were made of glass. But mostly, I wrote about the strange realization that exile might not be entirely punishment. For the first time in my life, I was living with someone who didn't seem to view my existence as an inconvenience. Ruth was demanding, certainly, and not particularly warm, but she also didn't flinch when I entered a room or sigh heavily when I spoke. She treated me like a person whose presence had practical value, whose contributions mattered, whose thoughts might be worth hearing. It was a small thing, perhaps, but after 17 years of feeling like a burden, even small recognition felt revolutionary. November arrived with the kind of bitter cold that cuts through inadequate jackets and settles deep in your bones. The fields around Ruth's house turned brown and barren, and the trees stood like skeletal sentinels against gray skies that threatened snow. I had never experienced winter in such an isolated place, where the cold felt personal, deliberate, as if nature itself was testing my resolve to stay alive. It was during this first taste of Montana winter that I received my first letter from home. Ruth handed it to me at breakfast with the same neutral expression she used for everything, neither encouraging nor discouraging my reaction. The envelope bore my mother's careful handwriting, my name spelled out in the precise script she had learned in Catholic school decades ago. I carried the letter to my room, my hands trembling with something that might have been hope or might have been dread. After 6 weeks of silence, any communication from my old life felt simultaneously precious and potentially devastating. I sat on my narrow bed and opened the envelope with the care of someone diffusing a bomb. The letter was brief, almost businesslike in its tone. My mother wrote about small domestic details. The washing machine had finally been repaired. My father had received a promotion at work. Michael had called to say he was doing well in his senior year. She asked polite questions about my health, my schoolwork, whether Ruth was treating me well. But beneath the careful pleasantries, I could sense a deliberate distance, as if she were writing to a distant relative rather than her own daughter. The letter ended with a paragraph that stopped my breath. We hope you're learning important lessons about independence and responsibility. This time away has been good for all of us, I think. The house feels more peaceful, and your father and I have been able to focus on our own relationship and goals. We're proud of you for adapting so well to your new situation. More peaceful. The house felt more peaceful without me in it. She had written those words without apparent irony, without recognition that she was essentially confirming what I had always suspected, that my very presence had been a source of disruption in their lives, that my absence was experienced as relief rather than loss. I read the letter 3 times, searching for some hidden message of longing or regret, some indication that I was missed despite being the cause of domestic turbulence. But there was nothing, just politeness and distance and the clear implication that this exile was working exactly as intended. That evening, I found Ruth in her study, as usual, surrounded by papers and nursing a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. I knocked on the doorframe and waited for her to look up. "I got a letter from my mother today," I said. Ruth nodded, unsurprised. "First one?" "Yes, she says they're proud of how well I'm adapting. Says the house is more peaceful without me." Ruth studied my face with her editor's attention to detail, cataloging the hurt I was trying to hide behind a facade of casual indifference. "And how does that make you feel?" The question was so direct, so unlike anything my parents would have asked, that it took me a moment to formulate an answer, like I was right all along. About being unwanted. About being a burden they finally figured out how to get rid of. Ruth set down her pen and removed her reading glasses, giving me her full attention. "Your mother is my sister, Emma, and I love her. But Margaret has always been someone who needs to convince herself that her choices are not only correct, but morally superior. If she admitted to missing you, she would have to confront the possibility that sending you away was cruel rather than constructive." Her words hung in the air between us, more honest than anything I had heard from an adult in years. "So you think she does miss me?" "I think your mother is complicated and frightened, and probably ashamed of decisions she doesn't know how to undo. But what I think doesn't matter as much as what you do with the reality of your situation." I sat down in the chair across from her desk, drawn by the unusual opportunity for honest conversation. "Which is that you're here now, whether by choice or circumstance, and you can either spend your energy mourning a relationship that was never what you needed it to be, or you can start building a life that belongs to you." Over the following weeks, Ruth and I began to have more of these conversations. Not warm, exactly warmth wasn't in Ruth's nature, but real in a way that felt foreign and valuable. She told me about her own childhood, how she and my mother had grown up in a house where emotions were viewed as inconveniences and children were expected to be seen but not heard. She spoke about choosing to remain unmarried, to live alone, to build a life around work and books and solitude rather than the messy complications of family relationships. "Your mother chose differently," Ruth said one evening as we sat in her living room, me with my notebook and her with a manuscript. She wanted the conventional life, husband, children, suburban respectability. But she never learned how to navigate the emotional complexity that comes with those choices. When you turned out to be more complicated than she expected, she didn't know how to adjust her vision of the perfect family to include a child who required more than she was prepared to give. So she gave up on me instead. She sent you to someone who might be better equipped to help you figure out who you're supposed to become. The possibility that my exile might have been an act of love, however misguided, was something I had never considered. It felt dangerous to hope for such interpretation, but Ruth's words planted a seed of doubt about my own certainty regarding my parents' motivations. That night, I wrote in my notebook about the difference between being unwanted and being misunderstood, about the ways people can love inadequately without loving less. The words came easier now, flowing onto the page with increasing confidence as I began to understand that my thoughts had value, independent of anyone else's approval or validation. December brought the first serious snowfall, transforming Ruth's property into something that looked almost magical in the early morning light. I had never seen so much snow, never experienced the peculiar silence that settles over the world when everything is muffled under white blankets. From my bedroom window, I watched deer pick their way delicately across the fields, leaving perfect tracks that would disappear with the next wind dot. The snow also brought unexpected visitors. Ruth's neighbor, an elderly man named Frank who lived in the farmhouse half a mile down the road, appeared at our door one morning with a snowblower and an offer to clear our driveway. Behind him stood a boy about my age, tall and lanky with dark hair escaping from under a knit cap. "This is my grandson Jake," Frank said, stomping snow off his boots on Ruth's front porch. "He's staying with me for the holidays, and I figured he could use some exercise helping with the driveway." Jake nodded politely when Ruth introduced me, but his eyes held the kind of cautious interest that suggested he might actually see me, rather than through me. When Frank and Ruth retreated to the kitchen to discuss neighborly matters over coffee, Jake and I found ourselves alone on the porch, surrounded by the crystalline silence of fresh snow. "So you're the girl from back east," he said, not unkindly but with obvious curiosity. "News travels fast in small towns," I replied, surprised by my own ability to make conversation with a stranger, especially when the new arrival is living with the mysterious Ruth Morrison, who nobody quite knows what to make of. He grinned, and I realized that he had an easy way about him, a comfort with himself that I envied immediately. Over the following weeks, as winter settled in earnest over Cedar Falls, Jake became a regular presence in my new life. He helped Ruth with heavy maintenance tasks that were difficult for two women to manage alone. But more importantly, he became the first person my age who seemed genuinely interested in who I was, rather than who I was in single quotes to. Jake was a senior at a high school in the next county, planning to study forestry in college because he loved the outdoors more than anything else. He was staying with his grandfather while his parents went through a messy divorce, which gave us something in common: the experience of being displaced by family circumstances beyond our control, but where I carried my displacement like a wound. Jake seemed to view his as an adventure. He explored the countryside around Cedar Falls with the enthusiasm of someone discovering hidden treasure, and gradually he began inviting me to join him on his expeditions. We snowshoed through silent forests, our breath visible and crystalline puffs as we followed animal tracks through pristine powder. We climbed to the top of a hill that overlooked the entire valley, where Jake taught me to identify different types of evergreens by their silhouettes against the winter sky. We built enormous snow sculptures in Ruth's front yard, laughing until our sides hurt at our increasingly ridiculous creations. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to have a friend who chose my company not out of obligation or convenience, but because he genuinely enjoyed being around me. Jake listened when I talked, asked questions that showed he was paying attention, shared his own thoughts and dreams with the kind of openness I had never encountered before. "You're different than I expected," he told me one afternoon as we sat in Ruth's kitchen, warming up after a long hike through snow-covered fields. "Different how? Quieter but not shy. Like you're thinking about everything all the time, cataloging it somehow." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Frank says Ruth thinks you're a writer." The fact that Ruth had discussed me with her neighbor, that she had identified something about me worth sharing, filled me with unexpected warmth. "I write stories," I admitted. "Ruth lets me use her books for research, and she's been helping me with some of the technical aspects of narrative structure." This was new, this collaboration with Ruth over my writing. She had begun reading my notebook entries, offering suggestions with the same professional attention she gave to her editing clients. Under her guidance, my stories were becoming more sophisticated, more deliberately crafted. She treated my work seriously, as if my words had the potential to matter to someone beyond myself. "Can I read something you've written?" Jake asked. The question terrified and thrilled me simultaneously. No one had ever asked to read my work before, had ever suggested that my thoughts might be interesting enough to deserve their attention. Maybe, I said, trying to sound casual despite the racing of my heart. That evening, I selected one of my recent pieces, a story about a girl who discovers she can hear the thoughts of trees during winter, when their silence becomes so profound that their dreams finally become audible. I left the notebook open to that story on my desk, where Jake would see it the next time he visited Dot. His reaction exceeded my wildest hopes. He read the story twice, then looked at me with something approaching awe. Emma, this is incredible. You have to show this to more people. You have to do something with this talent. For 17 years, I had lived with the belief that I was fundamentally flawed, that my very existence was a source of problems for everyone around me. But Jake's reaction to my writing suggested another possibility, that I might have something valuable to offer the world, that my thoughts and imagination might be gifts rather than burdens. Winter deepened around Cedar Falls, but inside Ruth's house, I began to experience something I had never known before, the warmth of being valued for who I was rather than criticized for who I wasn't. Between Ruth's practical support and intellectual guidance, and Jake's friendship and encouragement, I started to understand that exile might sometimes be the beginning of finding home rather than the end of belonging anywhere. Christmas approached, with its complicated mixture of nostalgia and hope, carrying the promise of letters from my old life and the reality of celebrations in my new one. Christmas Eve arrived with a blizzard that trapped us in the house for 3 days, but somehow the forced isolation felt cozy rather than claustrophobic. Ruth had never bothered much with holiday decorations, but Jake and I convinced her to let Use cut a small pine tree from the back of her property. We decorated it with strings of popcorn and paper ornaments we made from pages torn from old magazines, creating something that was humble but entirely our own. The holiday brought another letter from home, this one thicker than the first. My mother had included a Christmas card with a photograph of the family herself, my father and Michael, who had apparently come home from college for the holidays. They stood in front of the fireplace in our living room, smiling the kind of careful smiles people wear when they're trying to project happiness for the camera. What struck me most about the photograph wasn't who was in it, but who wasn't. The family portrait was complete without me, balanced and harmonious, in a way that suggested my absence had been not just accepted but embraced. Michael stood where I might once have stood, but there was no gap, no sense that someone was missing. From the composition, the letter itself was longer than the previous one, filled with detailed accounts of Michael's academic achievements, my father's promotion, my mother's new involvement with the church auxiliary. They sounded busy and fulfilled, their lives expanding to fill the space I had once occupied. Near the end, my mother mentioned that they would be taking a vacation to Florida in February, something they had finally been able to afford now that their expenses had been reduced. Understood the subtext immediately, without the cost of supporting me, my food, my clothes, my medical expenses. They had discovered financial freedom they hadn't enjoyed in years. My exile wasn't just emotional relief for them. It was economic liberation as well. But as I read the letter, I realized that the familiar ache of rejection had become something different, less sharp and desperate than it had been in the fall. Ruth knocked on my door while I was still processing. The contents of the envelope. Bad news? She asked, noting my expression. Not exactly, just ... Confirmation, I guess. I handed her the letter, curious to see how an outsider might interpret my mother's carefully chosen words. Ruth read silently, her face revealing nothing. When she finished, she folded the letter and handed it back to me. Your mother writes, like someone trying to convince herself of something, she observed, that they're better off without me, that she's made the right choice. But people who are confident in their decisions don't usually feel compelled to justify them so thoroughly. This was a perspective I hadn't considered. So, you think she feels guilty? I think your mother is discovering that getting what you think you want doesn't always bring the satisfaction you expected. But guilt is a luxury she can't afford, right? No, so she's working very hard to frame the situation as beneficial for everyone involved. That afternoon, Jake arrived with cross-country skis and an invitation to explore the winter landscape from a new perspective. We spent hours gliding through snow-covered forests, following trails that wound between ancient trees and across frozen streams. The physical exertion combined with the beauty of the winter wonderland around us created a kind of meditation, a temporary escape from the complexity of family relationships and uncertain futures. As we rested on a fallen log, sharing hot chocolate from a thermos Jake had brought, he asked about the letter I had received that morning. I told him about the family photograph, about the casual mention of financial freedom, about the way my absence seemed to have brought my parents peace rather than grief. That must hurt, he said, not trying to minimize my pain or offer false comfort. It does, but maybe not as much as I expected. I keep thinking about what Ruth said about people convincing themselves they've made the right choice. Maybe their relief isn't really about me being gone. Maybe it's about not having to face their own failure as parents. Jake nodded thoughtfully. My parents are doing something similar with their divorce. They keep talking about how much happier they'll be apart, how this is the best thing for everyone. But I think they're mostly trying to convince themselves that destroying our family was inevitable rather than a choice they made. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the way afternoon light filtered through snow-laden branches. I realized that this moment sitting in a winter forest with someone who understood the particular pain of family disappointment was more peaceful than any Christmas morning I had ever experienced with my biological family. I've been thinking about what I want to do after high school, I said eventually. And I want to study literature in college. Maybe become a teacher or work in publishing or just write. Ruth thinks I'm good enough to get scholarships, maybe even to some really good schools. Jake grinned. That's amazing, Emma. You should definitely do that. The casualness of his support, the way he simply accepted my dreams as reasonable and achievable, was still foreign to me. I had spent so many years having my interests dismissed or actively discouraged that encouragement felt almost suspect. Too good to be true, but as we skied back to Ruth's house through the gathering dusk, I allowed myself to imagine a future built around my own passions and abilities, rather than other people's expectations or limitations. For the first time in my life, I could envision myself not as a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved, but as a person with something valuable to contribute to the world. Christmas dinner at Ruth's was simple but meaningful. She had prepared a small turkey with all the traditional accompaniments, and Jake's grandfather Frank joined us, bringing homemade rolls and stories about previous winters in Cedar Falls. We ate by candlelight, talking about books and local history, and plans for the new year. As I went to bed that night, I realized that this unconventional Christmas had given me something my family had never been able to provide, the experience of being welcomed exactly as I was, without conditions or reservations. January brought a kind of clarity that seemed to arrive with the bitter cold and crystalline air. The holiday break was over. Jake had returned to his own school, and I settled into the rhythm of my final semester at Cedar Falls High, but something fundamental had shifted during those weeks of Christmas companionship. I no longer moved through my days like someone waiting for permission to exist. My English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had noticed the change in my writing assignments. After class one day, she asked me to stay behind to discuss my latest essay. A piece about the ways isolation can sometimes lead to self-discovery rather than self-destruction. Emma, she said, settling into the chair beside mine instead of remaining behind her desk. This is exceptional work. Have you thought about submitting some of your writing to competitions? Or to the school literary magazine? The suggestion terrified and excited me in equal measure. The idea of my words being read by strangers, judged by people who had no obligation to be kind, felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing if I could fly. But Mrs. Patterson's confidence in my ability was infectious. I don't know if it's good enough, I admitted. Good enough is the enemy of great, Emma, and you have the potential for greatness. Don't let fear keep you from finding out what you're truly capable of. That evening, I told Ruth about Mrs. Patterson's suggestion. She looked up from the manuscript she was editing, her expression thoughtful. Fear is a luxury you can't afford, she said, echoing something she had told me weeks earlier about different circumstances. You've spent 17 years letting other people define your worth. Are you going to spend the next 17 doing the same thing? The question haunted me for days. I realized that despite all the progress I had made since arriving in Montana, I was still operating from a position of profound self-doubt, still waiting for external validation to confirm what I might be able to accomplish on my own dot, so I submitted 3 of my stories to a statewide high school writing competition, addressing the envelope with hands that shook only slightly. I also gave Mrs. Patterson permission to include 2 of my pieces in the school literary magazine, a small publication that was distributed mainly to faculty and families, but represented my first reel. Publication credits that February arrived with news that changed everything. Jake called one evening, his voice tight with emotion, to tell me that his parents had finalized their divorce and his mother was moving to Seattle. His father wanted him to finish high school there, to start fresh in a new city where nobody knew about the family dissolution. I don't want to leave, he said, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. I like it here. I like the person I am here. But I'm 17, and apparently I don't get a vote in decisions about my own life. I understood that feeling better than anyone. We talked for over an hour, sharing our mutual bewilderment at the way adults can make life-altering decisions. About children without considering what those children might actually want or need. When do you leave? I asked, dreading the answer. Next week. Dad wants to get me enrolled before the semester is too far along. The prospect of losing my first real friend felt devastating, but I was surprised to discover that it didn't feel apocalyptic the way losses had in my previous life. I had learned that people could leave without taking your entire sense of self with them, that meaningful connections could survive physical separation. Jake's departure was as difficult as I had anticipated, but it also marked a turning point in my relationship with solitude. Instead of viewing time alone as evidence of my fundamental unlovability, I began to see it as space for growth and creativity. I wrote with increased intensity, channeling my emotions about friendship and loss into stories that were more complex and emotionally nuanced than anything I had produced before. Ruth noticed the change in my work immediately. Heartbreak can be excellent fuel for creativity, she observed. Reading a story I had written about 2 teenagers who meet during a blizzard and discover they understand each other in ways their families never could. But you're not just writing about pain anymore. You're writing about resilience. She was right. My newer stories dealt with difficult subjects: family dysfunction, abandonment, the particular cruelty of conditional love, but they also explored themes of survival and unexpected strength. My characters faced rejection and exile, but they also discovered their own capacity for independence and self-definition. In March, I received notification that one of my stories had won 2nd place in the statewide competition, along with a scholarship check for $500. Mrs. Patterson made the announcement to the entire English class. And for the first time since arriving at Cedar Falls High, I felt the focused attention of my classmates for something positive rather than merely curious, but the real validation came from Ruth's reaction when I showed her the letter in check. She read the notification twice, then looked at me with something that might have been pride. "This is just the beginning," she said. "You have real talent, Emma, the kind that can take you anywhere you want to go." That evening, I wrote in my notebook about the strange journey from exile to recognition, about the way punishment could sometimes become opportunity if you were willing to transform your circumstances rather than simply endure them. I wrote about Ruth and Jake and Mrs. Patterson, about the unexpected kindness of strangers who had chosen to see potential in a girl her own family had given up on as spring approached, bringing the possibility of college applications and decisions. About my future, I realized that the question was no longer whether I would survive my exile from home. The question was whether I would choose to return to a place that had never wanted me, or continue building a life in the wider world that was beginning to recognize what I had to offer. The letters from my parents had become increasingly infrequent, and their tone suggested they had settled comfortably into life without me. They had found their peace, their financial freedom, their perfect family photograph. I was beginning to understand that I could find something even more valuable, the freedom to become whoever I was meant to be, without apology or permission. April brought acceptance letters from 3 different colleges, each one representing possibilities I had never dared to imagine 6 months earlier. The State University had offered me a partial scholarship based on my academic record and writing portfolio. A small liberal arts college in Oregon had provided an even more generous package after reading the story that had won the competition. Most surprising of all, a prestigious East Coast school had accepted me into their honors program with full financial aid, apparently impressed by both my academic potential and what they called my unique perspective on resilience and personal transformation. I spread the letters across Ruth's kitchen table, staring at them as if they might disappear if I looked away too long. These were concrete proof that I had value beyond the narrow confines of my family's assessment, that institutions respected what my parents had always viewed as worthless. Ruth found me there an hour later, still staring at the letters in amazement. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me, studying my face with her usual directness. "Overwhelming?" she asked, terrifying, I admitted. "What if I'm not really good enough? What if they made a mistake? What if you are exactly as talented as they think you are? What if the mistake was all those years of letting other people convince you otherwise?" The East Coast school would take me back within a few hundred miles of my childhood home, close enough that visits would be expected, close enough that my parents might assume this proved their strategy had worked perfectly. The Oregon school would give me complete freedom to reinvent myself in a place where nobody knew my history. The State University would allow me to stay near Ruth, to maintain the first stable relationship I had ever known. "Which one calls to you?" Ruth asked, as if she could read my internal debate. "I keep thinking I should choose based on practical considerations. Cost, location, likelihood of employment after graduation. But there's something about the Oregon school that feels right in ways I can't explain." Ruth nodded. "Trust that instinct. You've learned to make good decisions this year. Don't second-guess yourself now." That evening, Jake called from Seattle to congratulate me on the acceptances. He had been accepted to forestry school at the University of Washington, and we spent an hour talking about our respective futures, about the strange excitement of choosing our own paths for the first time. "Are you nervous about being so far from Ruth?" he asked. "Terrified," I said honestly. "She's been more of a mother to me in 8 months than my actual mother was in 17 years. But I think that's exactly why I need to go. I need to know. I can stand on my own feet, that I'm not just trading one form of dependence for another. A conversation with my parents about college was surreal. I called them to share the news, expecting some version of the grudging approval they had always offered for my academic achievements. Instead, my mother sounded almost surprised, as if she had forgotten I was still attending school, still working. Toward a future. That's wonderful, dear, she said, but her voice carried the distant politeness she might use with a neighbor's child. We're so proud of how well you've adjusted to your situation, not our family circumstances, or this difficult time, or any phrase that acknowledged their role in my exile. I was apparently solely responsible for adapting to the consequences of their decisions. The Oregon school has offered me the most generous package, I said. I think that's where I'll go. Oregon, my father said when my mother relayed this. Information. I could hear him in the background, processing the geography. That's even further away. It's a good school, Dad. Really good. And they have an excellent writing program. A pause. Well, if that's what you think is best, you're 18 now. Old enough to make your own choices. The conversation ended with the usual pleasantries, the same careful distance that had characterized all our communications since I left home. But as I hung up the phone, I realized something had fundamentally changed. I was no longer seeking their approval or validation. I was simply informing them of my decisions, the way adults do with other adults who happen to share some history. Spring advanced toward summer, bringing graduation and the bittersweet awareness that my time in Cedar Falls was drawing to a close. I had found something here that I had never experienced before, a place where I belonged, where my presence was valued rather than tolerated. Leaving Ruth felt like another kind of exile, even though this one was chosen rather than imposed. But Ruth, with her typical directness, refused to let me romanticize my departure or catastrophize my independence. You're not leaving because you don't belong here? She told me one evening as we walked through her garden, examining the early vegetables she had taught me to plant. You're leaving because you belong everywhere now? That's what education does it. Gives you the tools to make yourself at home in the world. Graduation day was small and intimate, attended by Ruth and Frank, and a handful of classmates who had gradually warmed to my presence over the course of the year. Mrs. Patterson made a point of introducing me to several visitors as one of our most promising young writers, and I felt the pride of recognition earned rather than given. That night, I sat in my room packing the belongings I would take to college, more than I had brought to Montana, but still modest by most standards. I opened my notebook, now filled with stories and observations from my year of exile, and began to write what I intended to be my final entry about this chapter of my life. But as I wrote, I realized that this wasn't an ending at all. It was graduation. In the truest sense, not just from high school, but from the version of myself that had accepted other people's assessments of my worth. I was leaving Cedar Falls as someone fundamentally different from the broken girl who had arrived 8 months earlier, carrying little more than resentment and despair. I was leaving as someone who knew her own value, who had discovered talents worth developing, who understood that exile could be transformation if you had the courage to embrace the journey rather than simply endure the displacement. The summer between high school and college passed in a rhythm of preparation and reflection. Ruth had agreed to let me stay until August, giving me time to work part-time at the Cedar Falls Library to earn money for college expenses. The librarian, Mrs. Chun, had read my prize-winning story and immediately offered me hours helping with their summer reading program for children. Working with young readers revealed yet another dimension of my emerging sense of purpose. These children, ranging from kindergarten age to middle schoolers, approached books with the kind of hungry enthusiasm I recognized from my own relationship with stories. When I read aloud to them, I watched their faces transform as they entered imaginary worlds where anything was possible, where problems had solutions and heroes emerged from the most unlikely circumstances. One afternoon, a shy 7-year-old named Madison lingered after story time, clutching a picture book about a girl who lived with her grandmother because her parents couldn't take care of her. "This girl is like me," Madison said, pointing to the illustration of the protagonist looking out a window at other families. "Do you think she's sad all the time?" The question pierced through my professional composure and straight into the tender place where my own childhood pain lived. I knelt down to Madison's eye level, considering how to answer honestly without burdening her with adult complexity. "I think she's probably sad sometimes," I said carefully. "But I also think she might discover that living with her grandmother gives her things she couldn't get anywhere else. Sometimes when families can't work the way they're supposed to, new kinds of families form that work even better." Madison nodded solemnly, processing this idea. "Like how my grandma lets me help cook dinner and teaches me about plants, but my mommy was always too busy." Exactly like that. After Madison left with her grandmother, I sat in the empty children's section thinking about the conversation. 6 months earlier, I would have been overwhelmed by the parallels between Madison's story and my own, would have seen only abandonment and loss in her situation. But my time with Ruth had taught me that rescue can come from unexpected sources, that love doesn't always arrive in the packages we expect. That evening, I called Jake in Seattle to tell him about the encounter. He had been struggling with his own adjustment to life in a new city, missing the freedom and natural beauty of Montana. "It's funny," he said, "how being displaced from our original families has made us both more aware of all the different ways families can work. Like my relationship with my grandfather taught me more about being a man than living with my parents ever did. We talked about the ways trauma could become wisdom if you were willing to do the work of transformation, about how our experiences with family failure had made us more rather than less capable of recognizing and appreciating genuine connection. When we founded DOT in July, I received an unexpected letter from my brother Michael. He was working a summer internship in Denver and had apparently heard about my college acceptance from our parents. His letter was brief but warmer than any communication I had received from home since my departure. "I know I wasn't a very good brother to you," he wrote. "I was so focused on getting out of that house that I didn't think much about what it was like for you to be left behind. I heard about your writing awards and your college scholarships. I'm proud of you, Emma. I hope you know that what happened wasn't about you not being good enough. It was about Mom and Dad not being good enough." The letter arrived at exactly the right moment, when I was beginning to feel strong enough to examine my family relationships with something approaching objectivity rather than raw pain. Michael's acknowledgement that our parents had failed us. Both that my exile wasn't evidence of my inadequacy, but of their limitations. It felt like a gift I hadn't known I needed. I wrote back immediately, thanking him for his honesty and sharing some of what I had learned during my year in Montana. We began a correspondence that felt entirely separate from our relationship with our parents. Two survivors comparing notes on the process of recovery and self-invention. As August approached, Ruth and I began the delicate work of saying goodbye to each other. We had developed routines and inside jokes, shared references and comfortable silences that felt precious now that they were about to end. Ruth had become something I had never expected to find, a parent who had chosen to love me not despite my flaws, but including them. "I'm going to miss our evening conversations," I told her one night as we sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible shades of pink and orange. "Distance doesn't end relationships that matter," Ruth replied. "It just changes their form. You'll call when you need to talk through a problem. I'll send care packages when you're stressed about exams. We'll find ways to maintain what we've built. The night before I left for Oregon, Ruth gave me a going away present, a leather-bound journal, far more expensive and beautiful than the composition notebooks I had been using for my writing. For the next chapter, she said simply inside the front cover, she had written an inscription for Emma, who learned that exile can be education and that the family you choose is often more powerful than the family you're born into. Write your own story with courage and honesty. Love, Ruth. I cried then, finally and completely, grieving not just the leaving, but also the year of healing that was ending. The safety of this house where I had learned to value myself. The woman who had shown me what unconditional support actually looked like. Thank you, I said through my tears, for teaching me that I was worth saving. Ruth pulled me into a hug that felt like forgiveness and blessing combined. You saved yourself, Emma. I just provided the space for you to do it. That night, I lay in my narrow bed for the last time, listening to the familiar sounds of Ruth's house settling around me. Tomorrow, I would drive to Oregon to begin college, carrying with me not just clothes and books, but an entirely new understanding of my own potential. I had arrived in Cedar Falls as someone's unwanted burden. I was leading as my own person, ready to write the next chapter of a story that belonged entirely to me. Lie endure the displacement. College was simultaneously everything I had hoped for and nothing I could have prepared for. The Oregon campus was nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, with old brick buildings covered in ivy and students who seemed to carry themselves with the confidence of people who had never questioned their right to take up space in the world. My roommate, Sarah, was from California, the daughter of professors who had apparently been discussing literature and politics around the dinner table since she was old enough to hold a conversation. She had grown up assuming that her opinions mattered, that her thoughts were worth sharing, that intellectual curiosity was not only acceptable but encouraged. You're so quiet, she observed after our first week of classes. Are you shy or just processing everything? Processing, I said, which was true but incomplete. I was learning to navigate a world where people asked my opinion about everything from the assigned readings to the cafeteria food, where professors encouraged debate and disagreement, where my classmates seemed to view controversy as entertainment, rather than threat. In my first writing workshop, taught by Professor Martinez, a published novelist who had won several prestigious awards, one submitted one of the stories I had written during my senior year in Montana. The workshop format required other students to discuss my piece while I sat silently, listening to their analysis and criticism. The protagonist's voice is incredibly authentic, said a student named David. You can feel her isolation, but also her resilience. It's like she's been broken and rebuilt, and the rebuilding made her stronger. I love how the setting becomes almost like another character, added Maria. The way the Montana landscape reflects her internal journey from despair to self-discovery. As they talked about my story, dissecting its themes and techniques with the kind of intellectual rigor I had only dreamed of, I realized that my experiences, the pain, the exile, the slow reconstruction of self-worth, had given me material that my more privileged classmates couldn't access. My suffering had become a source of artistic strength. Professor Martinez saved his comments for the end. Emma, he said, this is mature work. The kind of emotional honesty and psychological insight that usually takes years to develop. Whatever. Experiences shaped this asterisk. Professor Martinez saved his comments for the end. Emma, he said, this is mature work. The kind of emotional honesty and psychological insight that usually takes years to develop. Whatever experiences shaped this, he paused, his eyes meeting mine with a mix of respect and curiosity. They've given you a voice that demands to be heard. I nodded, unsure how to respond. My throat tightened, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being seamed out as the class ended and students gathered their things. David and Maria smiled at me, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged in that room, not because I had pretended to be someone else, but because I had brought my whole imperfect self to the page. Later that evening, I walked across the campus as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting golden light over the ivy-covered buildings. I thought about home, about what I had left behind, and what I had carried with me. For so long, my silence had been a form of protection, but here, in this strange and challenging place, I was learning that my words could be a form of power.